Yours. Good morning, ladies. Good morning. Good morning. Neither Jill nor Judy could be with us this morning, in person at least. So Judy called and asked me if I would do the announcements, and with apologies. First of all, notice our wonderful Erica up there. She is not selling the hat. She's trying to return it to someone who left it here. Okay? You are fully notified. And this morning, with apologies, I have more housekeeping than usual, or at least I've been given more housekeeping to announce than usual by our fabulous, intrepid Erica. And if you don't know, we would not be here, we would not be organized, we would not be able to do anything were it not for Erica. So she is, yay. First of all, any of you know what this is? I think everybody does. It's a star. But we get to select one of those every year, and on it, it will have a word. I'm not telling you mine. And underneath the word, there will be a few Bible verses. And these are an encouragement. These are something that it's almost like a gift to us each year. And you can treasure this, and maybe you can take more than one if there's some left over next week. But they're being given out this week and next week. And I encourage you to take one because they're fun to either tape on your mirror or put on your desk or find in your purse. And I'll tell you something else I wasn't authorized to say. If you get one you got from a previous year, I think you can put it back and take a different one. Because I know I really appreciate all those that I have treasured over the years. Secondly, there is this, and you might have picked it up on the way in, and every year we try to pass out a questionnaire just in case you thought that the leaders ignored you and only did what they wanted to do. Let me assure you that these are carefully read. If you will give us your honest feedback, you are given a place to sign your name. You don't have to do it, but it really helps for us to get feedback from you as we plan for next year. Next week, sadly, is our last in our 10-week study. How many of you noticed that this year was 10 instead of 8? Aha, you didn't seem to mind. You're here on number 9. But sadly, next week is number 10. But the fun is we will have a celebration. We've done it different ways, different years. You may recall last year we were out in the garden, which was so fabulous. And we've been warned that the wind may keep us inside next week. But you know, fingers crossed and all that. But you can sign. I don't remember how the sign-up has been structured. Don't bring a lot of food, but if you volunteer or ask to, just bring a little, enough to give us an extra treat. And then many of you have, let me just back up. Our indomitable Betsy Reeves, when COVID hit in March of 2020, just thought, we have to keep meeting after the Bible study had just finished. And she decided she would invite everyone to her garden outside to continue meeting on Thursdays. And Erica put a kibosh to that and said, no, you're not. We're not going to take that risk. And we set up a Zoom that for 3 months met 6 days a week so that we could see each other. And many of you came in. Some were able to come every week, many not. And we then cut it back to a few days a week and then to 1 day a week. But we've been going ever since March of 2020 on Thursday mornings. We gather at 9:15 for chat and coffee, and then at 9:30 we have a study, and we end for sure by 10:30, sometimes sooner. And I just want to invite each of you to it because I think those of you who have come have found it to be not only edifying, say, in the script with the scriptures, but really an encouragement and a wonderful community. So you will have, Erica will send out information. Erica, will you send out to everybody the link? And she also reminds us every week of the link. And we will continue and do the last 2 parables in the book. And I think we'll take 2 weeks for each one. And then we're talking about maybe doing a study in the book of Hebrews. We've done various different things, including the book of Mark and lots of other things, the Psalms and many other things. The women of the Bible. We did the women of the Old Testament, the women of the New Testament, and many different things. And we alternate leadership. And so I just encourage you to consider that. Put it on your calendar for every week, and then you can't do it some weeks, but at least it'll be there. It's a wonderful fellowship. Okay, yesterday was the beginning of Lent. And for those of you who were here, and I didn't give Casey warning, and I don't know if you're prepared for this, but you gave the most touching, beautiful prayer at the end of the service yesterday. I would love it if you would. Okay. Did you copy me? Well, by the way, I'm Linda Later. Those of you who don't know, and I have a husband named Phil who insisted he would be the one yesterday to tell Casey how wonderful it is, and she emailed him a copy and didn't copy me. It's okay. I love you anyway, Casey. But I would just, maybe, Erica, if you would include that with her, whatever you send out this week. Casey, if you could send it to Erica, and I'll just take it from her. And that would be wonderful, because it just touched us so deeply. And of course, as you know, Lent, we maybe grew up thinking you had to give up something in Lent, but that's really, and we were reminded yesterday, not the point. The point is, what are we going to take on? What are we going to commit or recommit ourselves to? And it's wonderful to have that marking in the year as a special marking as we prepare for Good Friday and then Easter. So, all right, the parables. You want to hear from Casey, not from me. But as I look at the parables, sometimes I go, hello, where's the good news in this parable? I mean, there's good stuff, and then there are these things that kind of hit me wrong, at least, maybe not you. And this week, it's at the end, the third servant who, was trying to do the right thing, perhaps, take the talent that he received, since he didn't have any benefit, and give it to the one who has 10. For everyone who has will be given more, and the one who does not have, even what he or she has, will be taken away. So, sometimes I pray, sometimes I just wonder, where's the good news, Lord? And one thing that occurred to me was the fact that the most common admonition in the scriptures to us is do not fear. Over and over and over again, we are told from Jesus' mouth and from mouths of the prophets and so many other mouths, do not fear. He was afraid. We're not supposed to be afraid. So that was my takeaway, and I will get more from Casey, of course, today. So I would encourage you to consider that and consider whatever else God might speak to you this morning. So will you just join me in a brief word of prayer? Gracious God, we thank you that you do not want us to fear, that you have told us not to be afraid of you, not to be afraid of circumstances or things that happen to us, not to be afraid of other people. We thank you that we are secure in you. We also know that you will speak to us always from your word if we are but listening. And so we pray this morning, with all the issues in our lives and our world, that we might hear your voice amid all the clamor. Whoa. And that you would speak to us your word for each of us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks. God's voice comes in many guises, I think. Thanks, Linda. Well, yes, welcome to Bible study 9 of 10 today. So we're nearing the end. This parable that we're talking about today follows directly on the heels of the parable that we discussed last week about the wise and foolish bridesmaids in Matthew's gospel. And we'll find that it shares some of the same perspectives. But let's dive in. And I'd like to start today with a word about the context. This parable is about risk-taking and accepting responsibility for those valuable things that God has entrusted us with. And it's told, and this is, I think, important to recognize, it's told by Jesus to the others as he is undertaking a very high-risk venture himself. So his life will exemplify, I think, some of what he's talking about, what the parable is teaching. He has just left the relative safety of rural Galilee to go to Jerusalem, the capital city, where religious authorities and all the political authorities will regard him and his message as a threat to their status quo. But he takes this risk, and he goes anyway, because that's his understanding of what his call and his mission is. So he goes. Well, this parable comes at the ending of actually a long discourse. We talked about this somewhat last week in Matthew's gospel about the end times. Jesus speaks about this at some length. It's the third of 4 parables about waiting for this unscheduled end time when the Son of Man will return. Now, the end time is sometimes called more formally the parousia, or arrival in Greek, parousia, and it's expected to be a time of joy at the Son of Man's return, the Messiah's return, but it's also going to be, we're told, the expectation is a time of judgment, which will take place at the Son's return. And you may know this as the second coming, all words that refer to this event we're talking about. Well, the parables that Jesus has been telling give us positive and negative examples about waiting for this end, how we wait. The parables teach about the importance of expectant watchfulness, right, for the return of the Son of Man, sometimes called the bridegroom in these parables, sometimes called the master in these parables. They teach about maintaining readiness and having patience during the wait. Now, today's parable is going to take another little dimension on. It's going to talk about investing ourselves diligently while we wait. So you might say that these parables give us 3 necessary qualities for anticipating Christ: watching, waiting, and working. So as we turn to the parables for today, could we have this next slide? Oh, there it is. Okay. Let me quickly clarify what the term talent means. You may have heard this parable called the parable of the talents. I notice in our book it's called the parable of the bags of gold. But I wish that the modern translations hadn't done that, hadn't changed it. The talent is a word that had a very specific meaning, and I think we lose it a little bit if we call it bags of gold. The talent was a name for a precise quantity of gold as measured by weight. So a Greek talent was 60 pounds of gold, a Roman talent was 70 pounds of gold, but in either case, the talent was supposed to represent the value of wages earned by a day laborer in the course of 15 years. Okay, so a talent was a really large sum. We recognize that these 3 servants we're going to talk about got different amounts of these, but all 3 received a very large amount, at least 1 talent. So, interestingly, historians of language have believed that the word talent came into the English language in the Middle Ages in Europe, and from this parable, which I think is very interesting. The English meaning of talent God-given abilities and gifts. We talk about musical talent, athletic talent, and so on. Coming into English with that connotation, I think does a pretty creditable job of conveying what the talents in this parable represented, as we shall see. So let's turn to the parable. Could we have the next slide? There we go. And let's look for just a minute at its structure. It's composed really of 3 sections. And the first is composed of the verses 14 and 15. And here we learn that the master summons 3 servants and entrusts them with his assets prior to his departure. By the way, there are a lot of beautiful stained glass windows and frescoes. I've found a couple of us to see today from all around the Christian world that represent this parable. It's fascinating to look at. Okay, so the master seems to recognize and take into account the differing abilities of his servants because he entrusts them with different amounts. To one servant, he gives 5 talents. Now, remember, that's like 75 years' worth of wages. To another, he gives 2 talents, and finally, to the last servant, just 1. And he gives no instructions to these servants at all. They're allowed to take initiative, to make their own decisions about what to do with this wealth, his wealth, that he has entrusted to them. Can we have the next slide? Don't you like this one? The fresco. So, the next section of the parable, verses 16 to 18, describes how these 3 servants meet this challenge that's been offered to them. The first 2 servants utilize some real industry. They undertake some risk, and they each realize 100% profit. Not bad at all. The third servant we have depicted here in the middle decides to play it safe. He buries the money given to him. He takes no risk at all, and he neither gains nor loses anything. Now, the third section of the parable, and then we need another slide. There we go. It tells us about the master's return. This is verses 19 to 30. And he settles accounts now with his 3 servants. The first 2 have been models of excellence as servants to the master. They're resourceful, they're confident, and the master rewards them very amply. They are invited into the joy of the master. Now, how do we understand that? That's usually understood to mean that they've been invited in to the great messianic banquet, this feast and celebration that occurs at the second coming when the master returns. But now these 2 servants, commendable though they may be, aren't really the center of the story, are they? They serve as foils, really, for the third servant. So how is he dealt with when the master returns? Well, he's only able to return the principal intact to the master, the 1 talent that he was given. No additional interest is there for him to give back. And what's more, he tries to excuse himself, his lack of industry and initiative, by blaming it on the master himself. Did you notice that? Who he says is harsh and frightening. That's his reason, he says, for taking no risk, doing nothing, no initiative. So he seems to have been motivated not by trust and confidence, but only by fear, as Linda mentioned. And the master then calls him wicked and lazy, and off he's going to go. The next slide. Yep, there he goes. We have 2 on their knees before the master receiving reward, and the third one, is off he goes into the outer darkness where there will be the proverbial weeping and gnashing of teeth. And we've heard that phrase a number of times in the course of these parables. The day of judgment has arrived, and the third servant did not fare very well. I want to mention something about allegorical features in Jesus' parables. Jesus doesn't tell us simplistic stories, really, does he? They're simple characters, simple events, theoretically, but he never employs a standard set of predictable metaphors. And that's what I mean. What I mean by that is, remember that earlier in Matthew's gospel, we heard Jesus tell the parable of the unforgiving servant. In that parable, the servant had mismanaged a huge quantity of money, but the master forgave him the massive debt. And the servant wasn't punished for mismanagement. In that parable, he was punished for lack of forgiveness. Okay, so now this parable, the third servant is punished for mismanagement or lack of management. Jesus uses symbols differently in each parable, and I think that's important to notice. Each parable is a unique construction, beautiful construction of its own, with its own symbolism. So, what's the symbolism employed in the construction of this parable of the talents, the bags of gold? Well, we've already mentioned a few of the ways the story's features are usually understood, but you're welcome to refine these to find more of your own that's of meaning to you. But let's refine some of what we do know. The master symbolizes, usually, the Son of Man, Christ. His departure, he leaves and entrusts talents to his servants. His departure is the ascension of Christ to the Father in heaven after the resurrection, is how this is usually interpreted. And that ascension, we need to remember, left Jesus' early followers, especially, just wondering, when will this return come? And remember that the early church to which Matthew's gospel is addressed is written for a community that's still hoping very much for this imminent return. This parable has great meaning for them. Okay, the return of the master, the second coming, the parousia, talents, bags of gold, all the gifts and abilities entrusted by God to his people. And that can be monetary, yes, of course, but otherwise, many other talents, and we have them. Rewards and punishments handed out by the master for the handling of the talents, outcome of the final judgment that we anticipate at some point. And then lastly, the servants. Who are they? Well, servants of the master, whether in Jesus' day or our own, are Christ's followers, right? So they're us. If we're the servants in today's parables and the master is Christ, then what lessons might we take from the parable about the character of the one we serve, the master, about our roles and duties and responsibilities in serving him? And I want to start again by looking a bit more at the master. And look at what we're told. The master bestows gifts lavishly, abundantly. This was a huge amount of money he's entrusting these people with. He spreads his gifts wisely among his servants. He gives complete freedom to fulfill the responsibility as each talent recipient sees fit. And then the master rejoices and rewards with the servants who are faithful and industrious. The third, lazy and wicked servant, calls the master harsh and unfair because he's not rewarded. And the parable invites us then, I think, to weigh in. Is the master harsh and unjust? Is he unfair? Or is he generous and just? Now, I think as we think this through, we need to remember that Jesus' parables employ hyperbole, dramatic language. He wants to make a point. And let's remember that as we look at the drama of this parable. So the third servant is punished for bearing his talent, and the implication there, I think, is that he wasn't given the talent to just preserve it and give it back untouched, but to risk investing it. He didn't belong to him anyway, right? It was just given. It was given him to manage well by the master. Now, people always wonder, well, what if he had invested it and lost it? Then, how would the master have reacted to that outcome? right? When I think we're helped to consider the reward given to the first two servants when we ask that question, because they both doubled their money, and they both got exactly the same reward from the master. The one wound up with 10 talents at the end, and the other with only 4 talents after their investing efforts. So the point of the reward, wonderful reward that they received from the master, wasn't proportional, was it? They both got the same reward. So it seems that the result of their efforts didn't matter so much as the effort itself, the effort expended. This isn't a parable about financial acumen. It's about moral and spiritual acumen. Being a good servant involves taking some appropriate risks. And so it turns out that the greatest risk is to risk nothing on the master's behalf. The greatest risk is to play it safe, to live prudently, and never give yourself away in meaningful ways. So the parable teaches us then about faithful servanthood. If we're tempted to think the goal of faithfulness is to establish personal safety and security, this parable wants to challenge that assumption, right? Jesus is telling his followers, I think, to be bold and brave as they serve, reach high, and care deeply. You may know the name Dr. Howard Thurman, a real favorite of mine. He was just a wonderful theologian and writer past century. And he said that as Christians or servants of Christ, when we become really aware of the holiness of our master and the holiness of the life to which we're called to contribute, to work for, that it's like a crown is placed over our heads, and for the rest of our lives, we try to grow tall enough to wear it. I love that vision. So how do we begin growing into our crowns? Well, according to the parable for today, we might say it's by recognizing the treasures with which we've been entrusted. What are our talents? Can we have the next slide? There's some. Our goodness, our intelligence, our energy, our time, our love, our tangible assets. Have we buried them? Or are we risking putting them to work? We may never know the outcome of our investments, of all of our talents, but the effort always matters. I want to conclude by telling you about an interesting case of talent investment. This starts in 1876, and Johanna was a little girl of 10, and she was placed in an almshouse in Tewksbury, Massachusetts. Joanna's mother had died, and not long afterwards, her abusive, alcoholic father abandoned the family. So Joanna had become kind of a wild child and was nearly blind from a childhood eye infection, and her poor vision made reading impossible, and it limited her formal education. And there didn't appear to be much hope for her. However, a few years later, another woman, an older woman named Maggie Hogan, came to this almshouse where Joanna was living. And she took an interest in young Joanna and took her under her wing, and Maggie protected her and other vulnerable little girls there. And Maggie taught Joanna that she wasn't responsible for having been left there in the almshouse as an orphan, but she was responsible for the state of her own spirit. Well, Joanna learned eventually about the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, and she convinced the almshouse overseers to send her there. She enrolled in 1880 and graduated in 1886, valedictorian of her class. And after graduation, the director of the Perkins School recommended Joanna, who now usually went by her nickname Anne, for her first job, which would be to go to Tuscumbia, Alabama, to be teacher and governess to a 7-year-old blind and deaf child. Can you see where we're headed here? Anne Sullivan, began opening up a new world to her young charge, Helen Keller, who eventually authored 12 books, was a leader of the women's suffrage movement, and was one of the first prominent advocates for those with disabilities. Now, I think most of us know something about the remarkable achievements of Helen Keller. And most of us know the story of her lifelong devoted friend and teacher, Anne Sullivan. But how many of us knew about Maggie Hogan? Yet it's almost certainly true that without the simple and faithful devotion of Maggie Hogan, who invested her talents of time and patience and goodness and love in the almshouse orphans, neither Anne Sullivan nor Helen Keller could have known the lives they did and achieved the remarkable things they did. So it may not have appeared that Maggie Hogan had been given much to invest. Certainly not 5 talents worth. But that's really hard to judge, isn't it? I think this parable is teaching us that the Lord's return is inevitable, though the timing is unpredictable, and we servants have some things to do in the meantime. Be ready. Be faithful. Be wise. Be patient. Be prepared. Be busy. Investing whatever it is we've got. We can make a difference. We may never know the result, but God will. So with that, I'm going to conclude and send you off to talk about this wonderful parable in your groups. Good morning. God bless.